Rome, Ludus Magnus. The year is 120 after Christ. The empire's greatest gladiator training center is unusually silent this morning. Normally, there are sounds of clashing swords, instructors shouting, the movement of hundreds of men training. But today, in the central courtyard, there is only a circle of gladiators standing, watching. And in the center, a man is tied to a post, naked, bleeding, because he has just endured the punishment that the gladiatorial system reserved for the greatest transgression possible: cowardice in the arena. His name was Marcus, a Thracian, captured in war, sold as a slave, trained as a gladiator. He won 5 combats, but in the 6th, before 50,000 spectators in the Colosseum, he hesitated. He retreated when he should have advanced. He threw down his shield when he could have fought. He begged for mercy. And the crowd, furious at not receiving the spectacular death they paid to see, gave thumbs down. But the emperor, on that day, Hadrian, was in a merciful mood. He spared Marcus, sent him back to the Ludus. He thought he was being generous. He was not, because what awaited Marcus at the Ludus was worse than death in the arena. Today, you will discover one of the most brutal and silenced practices of ancient Rome. We are not talking about gladiatorial combat that is widely known. We are talking about the system of sexual punishment used inside gladiator schools. How men who failed were degraded in calculated ways to destroy not just their bodies, but their identity. How Roman society viewed masculinity through a specific lens, where being penetrated was the supreme humiliation. And how gladiators, already at the lowest level of social hierarchy, could fall even further through ritualized violation that served as a terrible warning to all others. The story begins with understanding what gladiators were in Roman society. They were not heroes. They were not glamorous celebrities, as modern films suggest. They were slaves. Infamous. Infamous was a specific legal category. People without honor, without civil rights. Gladiators shared this category with prostitutes, actors, and convicted criminals. They were property. They existed for entertainment, and they could be used in any way their owners decided. The Ludus was a gladiator school, but also a prison, a fortified complex, small cells, constant surveillance. Gladiators lived in conditions comparable to modern inmates. They ate together, they trained together, they slept in locked cells, and they were governed by brutal hierarchy, where the lanista, the school's owner, had absolute power. Training was violent. Deliberately, gladiators needed to learn not just martial skills, but also to endure pain, to face death. So instructors, usually retired gladiators, were cruel. They beat, they injured, they humiliated, all in the name of preparation. And among gladiators, hierarchy formed. Veterans dominated novices, the strong dominated the weak, and those who demonstrated cowardice, they fell to the absolute bottom. Cowardice was the unforgivable sin, not in the Christian moral sense, Rome was pagan, but in the practical sense, a cowardly gladiator hurt business. Crowds paid for spectacular combat. They wanted blood, courage, drama. A gladiator who retreated or begged broke the illusion, ruined the show, and cost the lanista money. So punishment was necessary to correct, to dissuade, to make an example. And the most devastating punishment was not death, it was collective violation.
stuprum, the Latin term. But not just an act, it was a ritual, public, witnessed by the entire school. The victim was tied up, and then, one by one, other gladiators were ordered to violate him, not out of desire, but as duty. To refuse meant to share the punishment. So they obeyed, and the victim underwent the supreme degradation that Roman society could conceive. Evidence comes from multiple sources. Seneca, writing in the 1st century after Christ, mentions punitive practices in the ludus. He does not detail explicitly, but alludes to punishments that remove masculinity. Juvenal, the satirist, refers to gladiators who lost honor twice, first through cowardice, second through use. Petronius, in Satyricon, has a passage where a character mentions knowing a gladiator who served his companions before Caesar. Archaeological evidence is more subtle but suggestive. Graffiti in Pompeii, a city preserved by the eruption of Vesuvius in the year 79 after Christ, includes insults. One says, Salutus the Thracian makes women sigh, but served men after fleeing. Another says, Crescens, victor of 5, defeated in another way. The language is coded, but the meaning was clear to Romans. And crucially, understanding Roman psychology about sex is essential. Romans did not categorize sex by gender of partners. They categorized by role, active versus passive, penetrator versus penetrated. A Roman man could penetrate anyone, woman, male, slave, youth, without losing status. But to be penetrated was absolute degradation. It meant assuming the female role, and in an extreme patriarchal society, femininity was inferiority. So the violation of a gladiator was not about sexuality, it was about power, about destroying masculine identity, about transforming a warrior into a non-warrior. And doing this publicly before peers maximized humiliation. The victim could no longer look companions in the eye, could not claim honor. He was marked permanently. And after punishment, the victim was not simply killed, that would be mercy. He was kept alive, forced to continue living in the ludus, but in an altered role. No longer a complete gladiator, now he was used for other purposes, menial labor, training practices where others could hurt him without consequence. And occasionally, if another gladiator needed relief, the previous victim was available. The lanista saw this as resource efficiency. A degraded slave still had utility. The frequency is impossible to determine precisely. Detailed records of internal ludus operations did not survive, but literary references suggest it was known enough to be used as a threat. Instructors warned new gladiators, fight well or serve poorly. Veterans told stories, they exaggerated
details. They created a mythology of terror, and it worked. Most gladiators preferred to die in the arena than face punishment in the ludus. Some attempted suicide. Records show cases of gladiators who killed themselves after returning to the ludus in dishonor. Seneca records the case of a German who suffocated himself by shoving a stick used to clean latrines down his own throat. He preferred agonizing death by asphyxiation to facing the coming punishment. Another record mentions a gladiator who jumped from the ludus roof. He broke his neck, instantaneous but intentional. But most did not have the opportunity for suicide. They were watched closely after failure, precisely because the lanista knew the risk. Investment in a gladiator was significant. Years of training, food, equipment. So the lanista wanted to punish, but also preserve property for future use. Suicide wasted investment. So prevention was rigorous, and there is an additional layer of horror. Gladiators who participated in punishment were not malicious volunteers. They were also slaves, also forced, and the act of participating degraded them too. Not as much as the victim, but forced violation leaves psychological marks on the perpetrator as well. Modern studies of torturers show this. But Rome did not care about psychology, it cared about discipline, and the system worked. The ludus maintained brutal order through calculated terror. Comparison with modern prisons reveals disturbing parallels. Violation in prisons is endemic, used as informal punishment, as a method of establishing hierarchy, as a tool of control. And modern society often looks the other way, makes jokes, "Don't drop the soap," as if prison violation were an acceptable part of punishment. Rome, at least, was honest about brutality. It did not pretend to be civilized while allowing atrocities in hidden spaces. But Rome also saw no problem. There was no reform movement. No philosopher argued that perhaps violating slaves was wrong. Stoics like Seneca argued for more humane treatment of slaves in general, but always with a caveat. Slaves were property. Owners had rights, and gladiators were a special category of slave, chosen specifically for violence. So, brutal treatment was seen as appropriate. Christianity eventually changed some attitudes. After Constantine converted the empire in the 4th century after Christ, gladiatorial combat gradually declined. Not immediately, it took decades, but the church argued against bloodshed for entertainment. The last recorded combat was in the year 413 after Christ. After that, the ludus closed. Gladiators were redistributed. The system ended, but the legacy remained. For 5 centuries, Rome maintained an institution where men were trained to kill for entertainment, and where those who failed were punished through systematic violation. Thousands passed through the system. How many were punished in this specific way? Impossible to know, but each one had an individual experience of terror, and the entire society was complicit because they attended the games, they applauded victories, they booed cowards, and they knew, even if they did not discuss openly, what awaited those who disappointed. Marcus, the gladiator from the beginning of this story, is not recorded in surviving sources. The name is invented, but the story is composed of countless real experiences, real men who faced an impossible choice, risk death in the arena or face degradation in the ludus. And many chose death. They fought with final desperation because they knew that losing meant not just the end of life, it meant the end of identity, transformation into a non-person, into an object, into a warning. So when you watch a film about gladiators, when you see the arena recreated digitally, when you hear the epic soundtrack, remember there was another side, not glamorous, not heroic, brutally real men who lived in terror, not just of death, but of something considered worse, violation that destroyed who they were, and a system that saw this not as an atrocity, but as a legitimate tool of control. Rome was a civilization of incredible achievements, architecture, law, literature, but it was also a civilization that institutionalized violation as punishment and accepted this for centuries without questioning morality. This does not make Rome unique. Every society has atrocities, but it makes Rome an example of how cultural greatness can coexist with systematic brutality, of how people can admire the Colosseum while ignoring the suffering